When people think about medieval Europe, they usually picture castles, knights, and plagues. But for many people living at the time, another fear was never far away: monsters. These creatures were believed to lurk beside rivers, wander lonely roads, invade dreams, and even enter homes under the cover of darkness. Some were warnings about real dangers, while others helped explain strange experiences that people couldn't understand. Today, we're looking at 5 monsters that haunted medieval Europe, and we'll start with one that was especially unsettling because, according to legend, it didn't wait for you to find it. It came to you while you slept. If you lived in medieval Germany and woke up in the middle of the night unable to move, there was a good chance you wouldn't blame a medical condition. You'd blame the Alp. The Alp was one of the most feared creatures in German folklore because, according to legend, it could enter your home while you slept and attack you in the place where you were supposed to feel safest. What makes this creature particularly interesting is how closely it matches what we now call sleep paralysis. Many people throughout history have described waking from a nightmare only to find themselves unable to move, struggling to breathe, and feeling as if something was pressing down on their chest. Today, we have a medical explanation for that experience. In the Middle Ages, many people believed they had been visited by an Alp. The creature has very old roots in Germanic folklore. In fact, its name comes from the same ancient source that eventually gave us the English word elf. Over time, however, the Alp developed into something much darker. Rather than a magical woodland being, it became associated with fear, illness, nightmares, and supernatural attacks during the night. One detail that keeps coming up in the legends is that the Alp didn't have a single appearance. Depending on the story, it could look like a small man, a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness, or even transform into animals. Cats, dogs, pigs, snakes, and butterflies all appear in various accounts. According to folklore, physical barriers meant very little to the creature. People believed it could slip through cracks in walls, pass through keyholes, or enter through windows before making its way to a sleeping victim. Once there, the Alp would sit on the person's chest, creating a crushing sensation that left them breathless and terrified. This attack became known as Alpdruck, which translates to elf pressure. Considering how many modern descriptions of sleep paralysis involve pressure on the chest, it's easy to see why this belief survived for centuries. The Alp wasn't blamed only for nightmares though. Folklore also connected it to tangled hair, exhausted horses, spoiled milk, illness, and other strange problems that seemed to have no obvious explanation. Another fascinating part of the legend involves an object known as the Tarnkappe, a magical cap that supposedly granted the Alp invisibility and many of its supernatural powers. Some stories claimed that if someone managed to steal this cap, the creature would become desperate to get it back, and it might even reveal its true identity. The Alp was also said to possess an evil eye capable of bringing sickness and misfortune to those unfortunate enough to attract its attention. Naturally, people looked for ways to protect themselves. Medieval households used a variety of defenses, including placing iron objects near the bed, hanging horseshoes nearby, keeping lights burning throughout the night, and reciting prayers before sleep. Some traditions even suggested positioning shoes so their toes pointed toward the door. Others claimed that if a victim could somehow learn the Alp's true name, the creature would lose much of its power. What stands out to me is that the Alp feels surprisingly modern compared to many other medieval monsters. Dragons and giant beasts belong to a world of fantasy, but the experience behind the Alp is something people still report today. The creature eventually became one of the most influential nightmare spirits in European folklore. Similar beings appeared across the continent, including the Scandinavian Mara and the figure that helped inspire the English word nightmare. Whether it was a supernatural visitor or simply an attempt to explain a frightening sleep disorder, the Alp survived for centuries because it gave people an answer to an experience that felt terrifyingly real. While the Alp was feared inside the home, the next creature was said to be waiting beyond the safety of the village. Across parts of Flanders and the Low Countries, travelers told stories about a sinister being known as the Kludde. Unlike many legendary monsters that simply existed in folklore as distant threats, the Kludde was believed to actually torment anyone unlucky enough to encounter it after dark. And if you think about the world people lived in at the time, it's easy to understand why these stories became so popular. Traveling at night in medieval Europe could be dangerous. Roads were poorly maintained, marshes and rivers often bordered the paths, and there was always the possibility of getting lost in unfamiliar territory. In many ways, the Kludde became the embodiment of everything that could go wrong once the sun went down. The creature is most commonly described as a large black dog with glowing or frightening eyes and unnatural strength. Some legends add another unsettling detail, claiming chains rattled behind it as it moved through the darkness. But what made the Kludde especially feared was its ability to change shape. According to folklore, it could transform into a horse, a raven, a cat, a snake, a bat, or even a human. Often, the creature used these forms to confuse, mislead, or frighten people who found themselves alone on a lonely road. One detail that appears again and again in the stories is a particularly strange attack. Witnesses claim that the Kludde would suddenly leap onto a traveler's back. At first, that might not sound especially dangerous, but according to the legends, the creature became heavier with every step. The farther the victim walked, the more crushing the weight became, until escape felt impossible. Imagine trying to make your way home through a dark countryside path while carrying a burden that seemed to grow heavier every minute. It's not difficult to see why those stories stayed with people. The Kludde was especially associated with marshes, rivers, bridges, reed beds, and isolated roads. These were places that already carried a certain level of risk, and folklore transformed those dangers into something people could picture and understand. Stories often ended with travelers becoming hopelessly lost, exhausted, or terrified after encountering the creature. Interestingly, the Kludde didn't always kill its victims. In many tales, it seemed to enjoy frightening and humiliating people more than anything else. This is where the creature feels different from many traditional monsters. Rather than acting as a predator, the Kludde often comes across as a malicious tormentor, taking pleasure in creating fear and confusion. Its arrival was sometimes announced by eerie laughter, strange cries, or unexplained noises drifting through the darkness. Some legends even claimed the creature originated from witchcraft or evil magic, while others described it as a demonic force that simply existed to harass humans. As for protection, folklore offered surprisingly few reliable solutions. One of the more unusual beliefs involved throwing a handkerchief on the ground. According to the stories, the Kludde would be compelled to stop and tear the cloth apart, thread by thread, giving the victim a chance to escape. Like many supernatural beings throughout Europe, it was also believed that prayers and religious symbols could provide protection. What makes the Kludde interesting is that it reflects a very real medieval fear. Most people weren't worried about encountering a dragon on their way home. They were worried about getting lost, falling into a marsh, being robbed, or disappearing into a dark road where nobody would find them until morning. The Kludde gave those fears a face. Today it remains one of the most famous creatures in Flemish folklore, and it is often compared to the black dog legends found throughout Britain. Even now it survives as a reminder of a time when the darkness beyond the village boundary felt much larger and much more dangerous than it does today. Many of Europe's most feared creatures were said to lurk in dark forests or wander lonely roads. The Vodník, however, was believed to be waiting somewhere much closer to everyday life. In the villages of what are now the Czech Republic and Slovakia, rivers, ponds, and streams were essential. They provided water, powered mills, supported fishing, and helped entire communities survive. At the same time, they could be incredibly dangerous. According to folklore, those waters were not always empty. The Vodník was one of the most famous water spirits in Slavic tradition, particularly in Czech and Slovak folklore. Closely related to the East Slavic Vodianoi, this creature was believed to live beneath the surface of rivers, ponds, lakes, marshes, and mill streams, watching the people who lived nearby. Unlike some monsters that were described as completely inhuman, the Vodník often looked surprisingly ordinary at first glance. Many stories portray him as a green man sitting near the water's edge, quietly smoking a pipe or watching the current flow past. But there was usually something strange about him. His clothes might be soaking wet despite standing on dry land. Water could drip continuously from his coat sleeves. His hair might be green, tangled with algae or covered in pond weeds. No matter how human he appeared, there was always a sign that he belonged to the water. In some tales, the Vodník behaves almost like a mysterious neighbor. In others, he becomes far more dangerous. According to the stories, he would sometimes wait near riverbanks, reeds, bridges, or ponds, luring people closer before dragging them beneath the surface. Children were often warned about these spirits, and many researchers believe the legends may have served as cautionary tales designed to keep people away from dangerous waters. But what truly separates the Vodník from other water monsters is one particularly disturbing belief. According to folklore, the Vodník drowned his victims and collected their souls. Many stories claim that after a person drowned, their soul would be captured and stored in a pot or cup inside the Vodník's underwater home. These trapped souls remain there indefinitely unless someone managed to free them. What stands out to me is how unusual this detail is. The Vodník was also believed to have power over what happened after taking someone's life, making him far more unsettling than a creature that simply attacked and disappeared. Like many folkloric beings, the Vodník wasn't exactly the same everywhere. In East Slavic traditions, his relative, the Vodianoi, was often portrayed as openly hostile. Stories claimed he could damage water mills, break dams, drown people and livestock, and drag victims into his underwater dwelling. In Czech and Slovak folklore, the character could be more complicated. Some stories depict him as a trickster, while others present him as a genuinely dangerous supernatural being that catches people through deception, ribbons, nets, or simple bad luck. For communities that depended on rivers and ponds, avoiding these spirits wasn't always possible. Fishermen, millers, and others who worked near water often treated such beings with caution. In some traditions, offerings were left behind to gain favor or prevent misfortune. That idea says a lot about how people viewed the natural world. Water was essential for survival, but it could also become deadly without warning. Folklore gave that uncertainty a face. The Vodník remains one of the best figures in Czech and Slovak folklore today. He appears in fairy tales, paintings, songs, literature, and even classical music. Even centuries later, the legend continues to endure because it captures a feeling that most people can still understand. A calm pond or a slow-moving river may look peaceful from the shore, but beneath the surface, there is always an element of mystery. And according to generations of folklore, the mystery sometimes had a name. By this point, we've looked at creatures that haunted bedrooms, lonely roads, and dangerous waterways. The next being is much harder to define because depending on where you were in Hungary, the Lidérc could be several different things at once. A monster, a spirit, a supernatural lover, or even a source of wealth. The Lidérc is one of the strangest creatures in Hungarian folklore because it doesn't have a single appearance or role. Instead, the name refers to several supernatural beings that share similar traits, all connected to temptation, nightmares, sickness, and misfortune. Its origins likely combine older Hungarian beliefs with later Christian ideas about demons and evil spirits. Stories about the creature were especially common in rural communities, where unexplained illnesses, strange dreams, and sudden changes in fortune often demanded an explanation. One of the most famous versions of the Lidérc appeared as a supernatural lover. According to folklore, the creature could hatch from the first egg laid by a black hen. The process itself was unusual. A person had to keep the egg warm under their arm until the creature emerged. That may sound strange enough, but things only became more unsettling after it hatched. The Lidérc would become attached to its owner and begin visiting them at night. If the owner was a woman, the creature often appeared as a man. If the owner was a man, it could appear as a woman. In either case, the relationship was never beneficial. According to the stories, the Lidérc slowly drained the victim's strength and vitality. People became weak, exhausted, and ill, while the creature continued its nightly visit. What makes this particularly interesting is how closely it resembles folklore surrounding sleep paralysis and nighttime attacks by supernatural beings. In fact, this Hungarian word literally means Lidérc pressure, referring to the sensation of something pressing down on a sleeping person's chest. That connection feels surprisingly similar to the Alp we discussed earlier, suggesting that people in different regions often developed their own explanations for the same frightening experience. But the Lidérc wasn't always associated with nightmares. Some stories describe it as a supernatural familiar capable of bringing wealth and treasure to its owner. Gold, valuables, and good fortune would mysteriously appear, and the person's financial situation could improve dramatically. At first, that sounds like a pretty good deal. The problem was that the creature never truly left. The owner became tied to the Lidérc, and getting rid of it could be extremely difficult. According to folklore, one of the only solutions was to assign it an impossible task. People might order it to carry water in a sieve, or transport sand using a rope. Unable to complete the task, the creature would become occupied forever and eventually disappear. Personally, I think this version of the story says a lot about how people viewed sudden wealth. The idea that riches always come with a hidden cost appears in folklore all over the world, and the Lidérc is a perfect example of that theme. And as if those forms weren't strange enough, there was also a fiery version of the creature. In this form, the Lidérc appears as a flying ball of fire streaking across the night sky. Witnesses described sparks and flames trailing behind it as it moved through the darkness, making it resemble the will-o'-the-wisp legends found throughout Europe. This fiery spirit was often connected to demonic visitors or the souls of the dead. Stories claimed it could enter homes through chimneys or keyholes, bringing fear, illness, and bad fortune with it. It was also frequently reported near graveyards and isolated roads before disappearing with the arrival of dawn. Like many supernatural beings, the Lidérc came with its own collection of protective rituals. People used incense, birch branches, and prayers to defend themselves. Some legends claimed the fiery form lost its power when a rooster crowed at sunrise, forcing it to retreat with the coming of daylight. What makes the Lidérc stand out among European folklore is how many different fears it combines into a single creature. Depending on the story, it can resemble a vampire, an incubus, a magical servant, or a wandering fire spirit. That flexibility may be the reason the legend survived for so long. The Lidérc could explain nightmares, illness, greed, temptation, obsession, and even unexpected fortune. Whatever form it took, the message was usually the same. Be careful what you invite into your life, because getting rid of it may be far more difficult than you expected. Many of the creatures we've looked at today were tied to specific fears. The Alp explained nightmares. The Kludde embodied the dangers of lonely roads. The Vodník reflected the risks of rivers and ponds. The Lidérc became a symbol of temptation, obsession, and misfortune. The Basilisk was different. In medieval Europe, it was considered one of the deadliest monsters imaginable. Known as the King of Serpents, the Basilisk earned a reputation so terrifying that some people believed a single glance from the creature could kill instantly. You didn't even have to touch it or be bitten by it. Simply seeing it could be enough. What makes the Basilisk particularly interesting is that its story didn't begin in the Middle Ages. The earliest known description comes from the Roman writer Pliny the Elder in the 1st century. He described a small but extraordinarily dangerous serpent living in North Africa. According to his account, the creature's venom was so powerful that it could kill other animals and scorch vegetation simply through its presence. Over time, medieval Europe transformed that already frightening serpent into something far more monstrous. As stories spread through bestiaries, religious writings, and folklore, the basilisk gained new powers and increasingly supernatural characteristics. It eventually became one of the most feared creatures in medieval imagination. Early descriptions portrayed it as a serpent marked by a crown-like crest on its head, which is where the title King of Serpents came from. Later depictions became even stranger. Some artists and writers began giving it features of a rooster, creating a creature that closely resembled another famous monster known as the cockatrice. Regardless of its appearance, the basilisk's reputation always centered on its deadly powers. Its most famous ability was its lethal gaze. According to legend, anyone who looked directly at the creature would die almost immediately. Other stories claimed its breath poisoned air around it, withered plants, cracked stones, and destroyed living things unfortunate enough to come too close. Imagine how terrifying a creature like that would have seemed to medieval audiences. Most monsters could be fought, escaped, or hidden from. The basilisk represented something far worse. It was danger in its purest form. A creature whose very existence contaminated the world around it. And yet, despite all its power, folklore insisted that the basilisk was not invincible. One of its strangest weaknesses was the humble weasel. Medieval writers believed the weasel was the creature's natural enemy and could successfully kill it despite its deadly abilities. Another popular belief claimed that the crowing of a rooster could destroy a basilisk. Considering that some versions of the monster had rooster-like features, it's an ironic detail that medieval storytellers seemed to enjoy. Perhaps the most famous weakness involved mirrors. According to a popular legend, if a basilisk saw its own reflection, its deadly power would turn back upon itself. The creature would effectively become the victim of its own lethal gaze. What stands out to me is how symbolic the basilisk became over time. Medieval Christian writers often used it as a representation of evil, corruption, pride, and spiritual danger. Its ability to kill with a glance made it a powerful metaphor for temptation and destructive influence. As a result, the creature appeared in religious art, sermons, moral literature, and heraldry throughout Europe. In many ways, the basilisk had become more than a monster. It became a warning. That symbolic role helped the creature survive long after most people stopped believing it existed. From medieval manuscripts to modern fantasy novels, films, games, and popular culture, the basilisk remains one of the most recognizable legendary creatures ever created. And perhaps that's fitting, because out of all the monsters that haunted medieval Europe, none carried a reputation quite like the King of Serpents. A creature so feared that, according to legend, looking at it could be the last thing you ever did. These creatures may seem very different from one another, but they all came from the same place: the fears of everyday people trying to understand a world filled with uncertainty. Whether it was nightmares, dangerous roads, deep water, temptation, or unexplained death, each monster gave a face to something people genuinely feared. These stories have survived for centuries because the fears behind them still feel familiar. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.